All right, this lecture is going to be about the urinary system, sometimes called the excretory system. So the major functions of the urinary system are to form and store urine, which allows us to get rid of some waste products. Also excrete the urine, and then also the kidneys play a key role at regulating blood volume. So as you're going to see, the kidneys are the main organs of the urinary system. And one more thing, erythrocyte production is important. The kidneys play an important role in erythrocyte production because they secrete a hormone called erythropoietin, which you may remember from the endocrine system. So looking at the organs, we have the kidneys, which are retroperitoneal, which are behind the peritoneum, so they're kind of in the lower back area. Ureters connect the kidneys to the urinary bladder, so there's one ureter for each kidney. The urinary bladder is here. This stores urine temporarily. And then the urethra is how the urine actually gets out of the body. So it carries the urine from the urinary bladder outside the body. So if we look at a cross section of the lower back area where the kidneys are, kidneys, like we said, are retroperitoneal, so they're going to be back kind of on either side of the vertebra. Each kidney is going to have a region where the blood vessels and ureters enter, and that's called a hilum. So a hilum would be here and here on this one. And then the layers. There are two layers of fat around the kidneys, so they have lots of protection by this adipose tissue. So if we kind of start on the innermost layer, like on the kidney. So if this is looking at the kidney, that first layer right there is light colored. That's the fibrous capsule of the kidney. Then we have a layer of fat there called perinephric fat. Then we have a tiny, really thin layer right here called renal fascia. And then we have another layer of fat out here called paranephric fat. So kidneys are surrounded by lots of fat. Looking at the anatomy of the kidney, if we take a coronal section through a kidney, it'll look like this. And so I'll kind of jump around a little bit as we go through this, but this will also be really important for identification for your lab tests. So the innermost part in here is generally called the medulla. So all this is the medulla. This outer part is called the cortex. So cortex, outer part, medulla, inner part. And then you see that the medulla is divided into these little triangular regions. These are called renal pyramids. So pyramid, 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 triangular regions. Each pyramid is going to have a base, which would be here, and an apex, which is the pointed region. And then the little strips between the pyramids, those are called renal columns. So renal columns. And I'm going to jump down to the bottom really quick. And so if we take a given pyramid and the cortex region right outside of it, that's called a lobe of the kidney, a renal lobe. So a lobe would be all of this. That's outlined by this dashed line. So a pyramid and the cortex region right outside of it. Then after that, we have just different regions. It's kind of we're going to basically trace the flow of urine through the kidney. So when urine is actually formed, it's formed right here at the apex of the medulla, or apex of each pyramid. And this apex region is also called the papillae of the pyramid, so renal papillae. And so when urine is formed here, it's immediately going to flow through, we'll use this one because it's a good example, into this little tube called a minor calyx. Plural would be calyces, so these are minor calyces. Then those calyces merge to form a major calyx, which is just a little bit bigger. And then all the major calyces merge into this big area here called the renal pelvis. There's only one renal pelvis per kidney. And after that, the urine is going to flow into the ureters, which carry it to the urinary bladder. So when urine is formed at the renal papillae or apex, it goes to a minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, and then ureter. All right, so the blood flow through the kidneys is really important, and this looks like a lot, And it is important that you know the flow, the order of flow of blood through the kidneys. So we're going to run through it really quick. And remember, the job of the kidneys is to really filter the blood. That's why the blood flow through the kidneys is so important. So blood gets to the kidneys in a vessel called the renal artery. It's going to flow through the renal artery and then go into these branch segments called segmental arteries. And then the segmental arteries are going to branch into these little arteries going between the pyramids. These are called interlobar arteries. And that's going to lead into the arteries that run along the base of the pyramid. These are called arcuate arteries. And then you get these tiny little branches coming off the arcuate arteries that are called interlobular arteries. After that, the blood is going to flow through a tiny little vessel called afferent arterioles. There'll be multiple afferent arterioles. Then it's going to go, and if I can use this picture, it's going to be too small to see in this picture here. So if I kind of come over here, here's an afferent arteriole coming in. Then it's going to go into this big ball of capillaries. This is called the glomerulus. So, and the glomerulus is important because that's where all the filtration is going to take place, where the blood is actually filtered. And then the blood is going to leave the glomerulus and go into the efferent arteriole. And then we have a couple options. Depending on something that we haven't talked about yet, the blood flow is going to enter either a network of capillaries called peritubular capillaries, or it's going to, which would look kind of like this, or it's going to enter some blood vessels that look like this. This is called a vasa recta. So it really just depends on something that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, the type of nephron unit, and we'll talk about what a nephron is. So after the efferent arteriole, it's either peritubular capillaries or vasa recta, and then blood starts heading out. So we go back into interlobular veins, which are blue here, and then arcuate veins, interlobar veins, and then we're going to end up with the renal vein, which heads out. So notice that there is no official segmental vein on the way out, only segmental arteries. So these things called nephron units, these are the functional units of the kidney. They're where the filtration takes place. You have about 1 million of these in each kidney. So these are the parts of a given nephron unit. So, and I'll kind of talk you through this picture as I do it. So here's the, I'll use this one over here because here's the glomerulus that we just talked about, which is part of the blood flow. But surrounding the glomerulus, you have this little capsule. This is called Bowman's capsule. So Bowman's capsule, along with the glomerulus that we talked about, is called the renal corpuscle. And so what's going to happen here is the blood's going to be filtered here at the glomerulus. Well, the stuff that's filtered out of the blood, we're going to call filtrate, flows into Bowman's capsule, and then it's going to go down all of these tubes. This is the nephron unit. So it's going to go through this squiggly tube here called the proximal convoluted tubule. Then it's going to go through a loop. This is called the loop of Henle. Then it's going to go into another convoluted twisted tube called the distal convoluted tubule. And then eventually it's going to enter this big duct called a collecting duct. The collecting duct is going to terminate at the renal papillae, which remember is the apex of the medulla. And that's where the urine is officially urine. It's after the renal papillae, it's going to go to the minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, ureter, on its way to the bladder. So the filtrate flows all through this nephron unit, and it's not officially urine until it gets here. The reason being, because as that filtrate is flowing through these tubes in the nephron unit, you can still pull stuff out of it or add stuff back to it. So it's not a finished product till it actually gets here. All right, other things about the nephron, there's 2 different types, and this is why we had 2 different types of blood vessels earlier. So there's cortical nephrons, which generally have a very short loop of Henle. Then you have juxtamedullary nephrons, which have a long loop of Henle. And so how this relates to what we talked about earlier, with the blood flow, remember there was an option of peritubular capillaries or a vasa recta. So The peritubular capillaries are found in the cortical nephrons. The vasa recta, which goes all the way down here along the tube, those are found in juxtamedullary nephrons. And so urine formation consists of three major stages. So you get the filtration that occurs here at the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. You get, throughout these tubes, you can get tubular reabsorption where it takes in stuff, so you can add stuff to the filtrate. You also get the tubes to secrete stuff back out, so take stuff out of the filtrate. All right, so if we look closely at this renal corpuscle, here's the glomerulus, here's Bowman's capsule that we were discussing. So Bowman's capsule, which is commonly also known as the glomerular capsule, has two layers. So the outer layer out here, this would be the parietal layer, and the inner layer that's actually touching the glomerulus capillaries, this is the visceral layer. The visceral layer is composed of these cells that have little feet-like processes sticking off. So these cells are called podocytes, and their little feet are called pedicels. And if you look closely, you can see there's little spaces between their feet. Those are called filtration slits, and that's where the filtration is actually going to take place. So microscope slide of the kidney. This is the renal corpuscle with the glomerulus. This is just showing you one of maybe the kidney tubules, proximal or distal convoluted tubule. Remember, kidneys are loaded with simple cuboidal epithelium. That's what you're seeing here. So leading in, and we kind of talked about this earlier, leading into the glomerulus, you have an afferent arteriole. Leaving the glomerulus, you have an efferent arteriole. And remember from our previous discussion of capillaries that some capillaries are fenestrated. Well, these capillaries in the glomerulus are fenestrated capillaries, which means they have holes, which allows for optimal filtration. So a bigger picture here. You can get a better view of the podocytes with their pedicels on filtration slits. Here's a good picture showing how the podocytes kind of wrap around the fenestrated capillaries of the glomerulus. And moving on after Bowman's capsule, we have the proximal convoluted tubule, which is relatively simple. It's simple cuboidal epithelium, has microvilli to increase surface area, and the cells can reabsorb nutrients and water. So the big thing is to know that it's lined with simple cuboidal epithelium. Then we have the loop of Henle, which has a descending portion and an ascending portion. And just one little interesting thing about it, as the loop of Henle goes down, it goes from simple cuboidal to simple squamous at the very tip. Then it goes back into simple cuboidal as it comes up. So the very tip of the loop of Henle does have some simple squamous in it. Here's another good microscope slide of the kidneys showing the simple cuboidal epithelium of the tubules and the glomerulus, or the renal corpuscle. Distal convoluted tubule, very similar to the proximal convoluted tubule, simple cuboidal microvilli. You do have fluid regulatory hormones working here. Remember, aldosterone and ADH help your body retain fluid, so they work on the kidneys. They work mainly on the distal convoluted tubule and also the collecting duct. And so the collecting duct itself, simple cuboidal and columnar, and it's going to merge to form the papillary duct where the renal papilla is, and eventually lead into the minor calyx. So an interesting thing that is not really shown in this picture is that there are multiple nephrons per collecting duct. So in other words, you can have multiple nephron units that all drain into the same collecting duct. So like looking at this picture, like this is a distal convoluted tubule from another nephron. Here's another one, and they're all kind of draining into this collecting duct. All right, so as far as blood volume regulation, there's something called the Juxtaglomerular apparatus, which I just want to mention really quickly. Basically, it regulates fluid levels in the body and also blood pressure, because fluid levels can have a big influence on blood pressure. So in the afferent arteriole, you have these cells called juxtaglomerular cells. And in the distal convoluted tubule, you have what are called macula densa cells. So the macula densa cells constantly monitor electrolyte concentration in the filtrate, and if necessary, they can actually stimulate these juxtaglomerular cells to secrete a hormone called renin. So renin is a hormone that causes a whole cascade of events, but the end result of that is that you're going to retain fluid. So this is one of the key ways that the kidneys help regulate how much fluid you have in the body. So macula densa cells in the distal convoluted tubule can activate or stimulate the juxtaglomerular cells to release a hormone called renin, which stimulates water retention. All right, and then kind of on the way out here, the ureters connect the kidneys to the urinary bladder. They're relatively simple. They're also retroperitoneal. They have different layers, so they have transitional epithelium on the lining, and then there is a layer of smooth muscle in there that helps get the urine through the ureters on its way to the bladder. The urinary bladder itself is right behind the pubic symphysis, also retroperitoneal, stores urine temporarily. So it's triangular shaped. There's an area called the trigone. So if you think about it, here's your urinary bladder. There's 3 openings. There's an opening for each ureter that's bringing urine in. Then there has to be an opening for urine to get out to the urethra. So those 3 openings form a little triangle. That's called the trigone. The lining of the bladder also has rugae, just like the stomach. So all that rough surface here, rugae. And more importantly, the lining of the urinary bladder is transitional epithelium. We talked about this early in the semester. So one of the places that we find transitional epithelium is in the urinary bladder, so it can expand and contract. And lastly, there is a layer of smooth muscle in here to allow the bladder to contract. And the muscle is actually called the detrusor muscle, and that's the smooth muscle in the wall of the bladder. So another picture, this is just showing you the transitional epithelium that makes up the lining of the bladder. It can expand and contract. And lastly, the urethra on the way out. So it connects the bladder to the exterior. It's going to obviously look different in males and females. So this is the female urethra. And one of the important things to know here is that it's lined with stratified squamous because of all the friction going on here as the urine passes through. Then there's 2 regulatory sphincters. So there's an internal urethral sphincter and an external urethral sphincter. So the internal one is part of the detrusor muscle, which is smooth muscle. The external is skeletal muscle. So obviously the skeletal muscle is voluntary. This allows you to hold the urine in until you're ready to release it. In male urethra, longer. It's going to go through the penis. So you also have an internal urethral sphincter, external urethral sphincter here, and it's going to pass through 3 distinct regions. So you have the region where the prostate gland is, which is going to still be transitional epithelium. Then it's going to go through this tiny little area where we have these glands called bulbourethral glands, and these have a reproductive function along with the prostate gland. And so that's the membranous urethra. And then we have the penile urethra, which is also called the spongy urethra, which goes through the penis and is lined with stratified squamous epithelium.